Okay, welcome back to American Government. This is our second lecture today on the three branches of government and checks and balances. Again, today this is pretty much your sort of standard stuff, but it's important that we cover it. And if you can hustle through this lecture, that's okay. But don't go too fast because I'm doing it different from how you've heard in high school or out there in popular society. It's important that we sort of get these basics right. But the three branches of government and checks and balances. Okay, the basics, the super basics. We have three branches. We have a presidential democracy with a Supreme Court and two legislative bodies, or we could call them two legislative houses. The keywords for this lecture are democracy, presidentialism, Supreme Court, legislative, the three branches. I should put checks and balances up there as well. American government is commonly understood as having three branches, as if it were a tree. This is why this part of the lecture is titled The Three Branches, and it looks like this. This is just a hand drawing, but here we are, the people, and then we have three different branches. This one is split in two because our legislative has both the Senate and the House of Representatives. That's our two bodies of our legislative. Okay, so this is sort of just a rough shot of what it looks like. Okay, the basics one, the three branches. The legislative branch, what's their main job? Their main job is to pass laws. That's what they do. They pass laws. Okay? The president also has to approve of laws. Doesn't happen that way in all democracies, as we will see. The executive branch. In the United States, the president is elected by the Electoral College. So we vote for a popular vote, but then we have this funny thing we talked about in our last lecture that kind of mediates how we do our voting. The president can veto bills. If he vetoes a bill, that's something that came through the legislative branch. They thought it was a good idea. They sent a bill to the president and said, hey, sign it so it can become law. The president can veto a bill, which would kill it. Does not become law. No soup for you. And the president is also charged with executing the laws. So he's supposed to enforce laws, everything from the Department of Justice and military to the FBI, the CIA, border security, doesn't matter what, education. If someone's not following the education law, he steps in and says, hey, you're supposed to follow this thing, and if necessary, he can sue them. And then lastly, the judicial branch, which in the United States, the top of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court, which also in the United States has a very strong power of judicial review, which is the right to look at any law that's been passed and determine if it's following the Constitution or not. So let's start with the basics, the legislative, right? Sounds like legislation, right? Legislative. Their main job is to come up with new ideas, new things they think we should be doing and put them into law. Remember, there's two. There's the Senate and the House of Representatives. Talk about that. All laws start as bills, which is just a fancy name for a proposed law. All laws must go through both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, which usually means they have to be the exact same bill, meaning the exact same language. There's a little bit of room for leeway here. If there's an of or a the missing, that's okay. If one section of the law is completely different, that's not. Okay? After bills go through both houses, the president gets the choice to sign or veto. If he signs it, it becomes law. If he does not, it becomes nothing. No law. But the legislative branch gets to do a few other things too, right? So the main thing they do is they come up with ideas for laws and they try to pass laws. But they also get to do things like approve of presidential appointments. That's what's called power of confirmation. They also get to approve treaties using the power of ratification. Both of these happen in the Senate. From Secretary of State to Supreme Court Justice and all the treaties ever made by a president, the legislative branch gets to do a lot, which is true. They also get to do the budget and even act as a court system through the power of investigation and impeachment. So maybe you've heard of Watergate, which was Nixon. He was caught illegally recording Democrats. He was a Republican. He was caught illegally recording Democrats. That's a big, big violation of the law. Really bad. They caught him. Went through the impeachment process. Well, he was going to go through the impeachment process, but he resigned instead. Bill Clinton was also famously impeached for having an affair with an intern. Differences. So it's important to keep in mind there's some very big and important differences between the House and Senate. For the most part, they're doing similar things, passing laws, but the way they act internally makes a big, big difference. And a lot of this has to come down to the rules. So again, we're going to have a highlight on the rules here in this lecture. We're not going to talk about rules forever, but it's important to really comprehend how rules are affecting our political life. It's a really important thing. There's a cool but somewhat messy list here, so you can follow that link, but I'm going to hit the highlights. The first big difference, just simple size. The Senate has 100 members, 2 per state. Doesn't matter how big or how small you are as a state, you get 2 senators. The House of Representatives has 438 people who are in it, so it's 4.5 times as large. And some states only get 1 representative because population-wise they're so small. Okay? So you might have a state which literally only has 1 person in the House of Representatives, but then they still get their 2 senators. California, it's the opposite. We have a lot of people who go to the House of Representatives, somewhere around 55. I don't remember the exact number of our delegation, but California is the largest, most populous state in the nation. It's in the 50s. So we have more than 10% of the total House delegation, but we still only get 2 senators. You know, Montana has 1 House rep, I think they only have 1, and they get 2 senators. So the House is what we say proportional to population. You get 1 member for roughly every 500,000 voters or citizens, while the Senate is not. You get 2 per state, doesn't matter how big. Another big difference between the House and Senate is the electoral cycle. In the House, all 438 of the members of the House of Representatives are up for re-election every 2 years. 2 years, got to go up for re-election. Another 2 years, another 2 years. Every 2 years, you're up for re-election. That means that the House of Representatives is prone to really flip back and forth. It'll be Democrat for a while, and then boom, it'll flip really quickly, and then it'll stay Republican for a while, and then it'll flip back. Frequently, the year after a presidential election, we frequently see big flips in the House, often because what has happened to Obama. It was a very Democrat House of Representatives, but then Obama gets elected, people were a little nervous about some of the changes, the House flipped. Same thing happened to Bush. He was elected with strong support in the House of Representatives. Took a little bit longer this time, but by the end of his tenure, the House was very, very strongly Democratic. People sometimes say, flip the House, right? And that's what they're talking about. We need money, we need voters, we need all of this because we're trying to flip the House. In the Senate, members are up for election every 6 years. It's a big difference every 6 years, and on a rotating basis. What the rotating basis means is 1/3 of them are up, and then another 1/3, and then another 1/3. So they're never all up for re-election at the same time. 1 year, 33 of them, they go for re-election. 2 years later, the next 33, they're up. 2 years after that, 34, because we have to make the numbers even, so it's 33, 33, 34, adds up to 100. Every 2 years, 1/3 of them is up for election, but once you're elected, you get to stay for 6 years. Really makes a big difference, actually. This is a really important difference. One of the other things that means is that the Senate doesn't change very quickly. The Senate will, 1, 2, 3 seats will change one way or the other each election cycle, but for big swings of senatorial power, it takes years, 8 years usually, 10 years to see big changes in senatorial power. There's one last really big difference between the House and Senate that's incredibly important to keep in mind. The first is that in the House of Representatives, whichever party is the majority party, they basically just get to do whatever they want, okay? They set the agenda, they decide what you're going to vote on, what you're going to talk about, they move bills. The majority party in the House of Representatives, very, very powerful. In the Senate, power is much more well balanced between the majority party and the minority party, okay? The reason that power is more balanced in the Senate is this funny rule that we call the filibuster, Filibuster. I had a Latino friend named Philly, and Fili is, Filiberto, and I used to joke that, he was like community organizer type, and he would go out filibusting, getting everybody really excited about filibusting. So filibuster. Some of you have probably heard of this rule. It's kind of in popular society, but it's commonly misunderstood, and so I want to explain it because it's really important. Okay, so let's think about what's happening actually in the Senate. When any political group is deciding on issues, they have to follow various kinds of rules for having conversations, passing laws, setting the agenda, etc. Those rules are called Robert's Rules of Order. It's a sort of basic set of rules. Came out of England in the 17th century when they were developing parliamentary democracy for the first time. That's not terribly important except just to give a little bit of context. But there's a lot of variation in the types of rules you can adopt, okay? So we have a standard set of rules, but you're allowed to do pretty much a lot of things on top of it. You're allowed to vary those rules quite a bit. And in the Senate, there's a very important variation called the filibuster. Here's how it works. Before you actually vote on a bill, you have to do what's called closed debate. Closing debate means we've been sitting there, we have this bill that we think is a good idea, so we're debating it, and Democrats say, yeah, it's great, and Republicans say, oh no, we don't like it so much, whatever. They're debating this and that, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. In order to stop the debate, you have to take a vote. You have to take a vote to close debate, so that everybody agrees, we're done talking, now we're going to go to what they call an up or down vote. Up is yes, it's going to pass, down is no, you lose. Okay? In the United States Senate only, a few states also have this, but we're not too worried about state politics. Only, you need 60 votes out of 100 to close debate. Notice it's a lot harder to get 60 votes than it is to get 51 votes, right? It's much, much, much more difficult to get to 60 votes than it is to get to 51. What that means is that if 41 people in the Senate don't want something to happen, they can prevent it from happening by refusing to close debate, right? We're talking. They know they're going to lose if they let it get to an up or down vote. So what do? Oh, this is too important. We have to keep talking. So you hold up the process and you just say, hey, no problem. We've got 60 votes. We can keep talking, or we can go on to something else. What do you guys prefer? And, most people would rather go on to something else rather than waste their own time. So that's how the filibuster works. It's important to remember people frequently associate the filibuster with actually standing there talking. It's called a talking filibuster. It's been made famous by this old movie called Mr. Smith Goes to Washington with Jimmy Stewart, who's a famous old school American actor. This is him. He looks tired, right? In this movie, fictionalized account, he gets elected to Washington, he gets there into the Senate, and he sees that there's this terrible, awful law that's going to favor the banks and blah, 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 all this kind of stuff, and he decides he's going to filibuster it. So he does a talking filibuster, which means he stood there personally talking for 24 hours. He looks tired, doesn't he? But the talking filibuster doesn't happen very frequently. What happens more common is what we call the silent filibuster. And this is far more important and far more common, and people don't have a good comprehension of it to begin with, okay? In the silent filibuster, senators do not need to talk in order to kill a bill. Rather, they simply put their name on the I won't vote to close debate list, and the bill never moves to a final vote. As long as you have the tally of 41 people, and you can present that to the majority leader in the Senate, and you just say, look, we have 41 people who do not want to vote on this bill, We will happily stand there and talk if you really want us to. So the threat of the talking filibuster is there, but you don't have to, but you just pretty much present that, and then people go, okay, let's go on to something else, or they might say, well, what changes would you like to the law, right? So that's another thing. You can enter sort of bargaining mode, and then in bargaining mode, like beast mode, bargaining mode, you say, hey, you know, what can I trade you in order to make this palatable to you? Smart politicians prevent a vote they will lose by using the filibuster to keep debate open, okay? Here's a long-winded summary. So this is actually a pretty good summary. Go get the slides. Look at it online. It's basically what I just said. It even has similar Jimmy Stewart kind of thing. This is intro level stuff. No one's doing it that different. But here's a helpful diagram to help you think about it. We're here on the floor, so this is just basic flow chart. We're here on the floor. We're having discussion on a bill, you know. Yay, it's good. No, it's bad, blah, blah, blah. And everybody gets to talk. You get to make amendments. You know, I move to amend to include, you know, more people, or to get rid of the bad people, or whatever. And then you have to do this. You have to vote to close debate. You have to have 60 votes here to close debate. Very difficult to achieve, as I said. And this is where the filibuster here. We refuse to close debate. So this is where your filibuster is. If you can overcome the filibuster, however, you only need 51 votes for that final vote, the up or down vote. Now, again, everyone who's smart, they stop the process here. So in the Senate, in effect, you need 60 votes to close debate, okay? So it's almost like you need 60 votes to get anything passed, but sometimes parties will let things go through that they don't like, but that they don't dislike that much. So they're somewhat reasonable, depending. So that's the basics of the House and Senate, right? We have a few big differences, and we have the main function, which is pass laws. Pass laws. The Supreme Court. Believe it or not all democracies have Supreme Courts. Not all have presidents either. We'll get to that later. And many democracies that do have Supreme Courts have different powers than in the United States. You know, judicial review is a common power that Supreme Courts have, but they have it in different ways. Sometimes it's like they can delay a law. Sometimes they can make small changes themselves to a law just to fix it. So there's lots of different ways that this works. In the United States, we have 9 Supreme Court justices. They are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So remember I was talking about the power of confirmation. It's very important. They also they hold their position for life, which is important because it frequently means just that. Many justices die on the court or only retire at the very, very, very end. And I do mean the very, 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 you know, they're 3 steps away from the grave and 1 foot in, as they say. And then they're like, okay, I retire. The main power of the Supreme Court is what we call judicial review. How does judicial review work? Well, the Supreme Court can look at any law in the United States to make sure it does not violate the United States Constitution, right? The Constitution is our main founding document. It contains like the basic rules and regulations, and you're not allowed to violate, to pass something that goes against the Constitution. So that, for example, the Second Amendment clearly stipulates we have a right to bear arms. You could never completely get rid of that right. You'd have to amend the Constitution. You could do that. You can restrict that right in a lot of ways. No rights are unlimited. But if California said, we're just going to get rid of guns entirely, that would clearly be a violation of the Constitution, and the Supreme Court would just say, nope, can't do that. You can do a lot of other things. You can regulate guns a lot, make no mistake, but you cannot just get rid of them. Let's see. If the Supreme Court finds a law to be in violation of the U.S. Constitution, then they overturn the law. That means they strike it out, okay? Sometimes they only strike out parts of a law, sometimes they do the whole law. They tend to try to keep things relatively sort of narrow in how much they knock out, but it's a mixed bag. Sometimes they happily throw out more than you might think necessary. If they find the law does not violate the Constitution, then they uphold the law. Uphold, right, means it's okay. So they uphold the law. And many big important cases have been ruled on by the Supreme Court over the years. Infamous rulings, right? So sometimes the Supreme Court, whether you're liberal or conservative, there's a few rulings that you like and a few you hate. Usually they're the same, it's just whether you love or hate them is different. But I think that's important. So I have a handout related to this. You also have the stuff from your book, but I'm just going to cover a couple of important cases just to give you an insight into how some of these really big things get decided by the court, sometimes for better, sometimes not, depending on, again, there's some for everybody here. So I did infamous because, famous means well thought of, infamous means not well thought of, and some of them, depending on where you're at, are more famous or infamous. Let's see, famous rulings. Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson upheld separate but equal doctrine in the South, segregation. They said, you know what, segregation's happening, it's fine. It took, turns out segregation was an awful thing, shouldn't be surprised by that. And it took 60 years before Brown versus Board of Education came along, which overturned separate but equal. Took 60 years, right? But that's the Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Really important case in civil rights, sort of hallmark early victory of civil rights, gave civil rights activists a very strong legal foundation to be challenging school segregation and other types of segregation. Roe versus Wade gave women the right to terminate a pregnancy according to the trimester system. Whether you like it or not, right? This is a really important ruling. It's had a huge effect. It's actually been modified over the last 30 years quite a bit. So they established the trimester system. They've kind of tinkered with it through time. But no matter how you feel, Roe v. Wade was a big decision that had a huge policy effect. And the Supreme Court did it under their own purview. They said, we're going to go ahead and do this. And this ruling is particularly famous because they argued that in the Constitution there's a right to privacy. But of course, the Constitution never says right to privacy. So where did they get that right from? Well, they looked at the Bill of Rights, the different amendments, and they said, if you take all of these amendments and you kind of think about how they work together, then there's other rights that aren't clearly specified there that we can see should fall under a little bit of this one, a little bit of that one, so they're all going to come together. What they call a penumbra, which is kind of shadow, right? So think of it that way, where you're kind of shining a light through the Constitution, and you see a kind of a shadow, right? And then that will maybe include a little bit more things than that are clearly stipulated. Of course, conservatives are losing their brain right now. That's fine. For something liberals can lose their brain over, I have for us FCC versus Citizens United. This is one of the most recent controversial cases. In this ruling, the Supreme Court basically threw out 100 years of campaign finance reform law. Just tossed it out. And the logic was, well, political speech is very important. Money is a part of political speech. Now, feel free to disagree with that, but that's what the Supreme Court said. They could be wrong. They are frequently. But they ruled that money is a part of political speech. And because political speech is so important, the regulations on it, we have to be much more careful. So they ruled that, well, you can give all you want, basically. And FCC versus Citizens United is the reason we now have so many PACs and super PACs, the political action committees. So complaints about dark money, billionaires who are just blasting money at the political process. It's FCC versus Citizens United that was the one of the main sort of contributors to that system. Okay, so that's pretty much all I want to say about Supreme Court and judicial review. Go look at my handout. There's a little bit of some extra stuff there. few more cases, a little bit of an extension of what are the justices doing and that kind of stuff. But this is the basics. This is the three branches of government. Don't want to spend too much time of it. So lastly, the president. The president of the United States is very powerful, not only because the United States is so powerful, but because the Constitution literally gives him quite a bit of power. Even compared to other presidents in other countries, presidential is very strong. This is the main list of his powers. There's a few more, but this is what we're going to cover. Veto, kind of already talked about that a little bit. Power of appointment, so that's justices and secretaries of state and all that. He's also the head of the federal bureaucracy, including the military. So, commander-in-chief. He's also educator-in-chief and, everything in chief. But the military sort of comes out. You can see it strongly there. He says when to send the troops in. Executive order / administrative decree. I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Pardon. President gets to pardon people. You broke the law. You were convicted. He can, on his own volition, write a little note, I pardon you, sends it down to the Justice Department, and they let you out of jail. And then foreign affairs, especially treaties. So president gets to, bargain with Iran, France, Russia, China, Brazil, Japan, Germany, France, England. Doesn't matter who. If you're making an agreement, president gets to take the lead. He gets to appoint people to the United Nations as well. Veto. It's not just an Italian dude in a suit. Get it? Veto? Okay, so lots of old gangster movies, there's some guy named Vito and he's in a suit and, veto. But it's spelled differently, of course. That's V-I-T-O. This is V-E-T-O, veto. And veto is the power of the president to prevent bills from becoming laws. Appointment is the power to hire and usually fire anyone who works for the federal bureaucracy. There's some exceptions like Supreme Court justices. Lots of people he gets to appoint. The power to order military actions, even without the approval of Congress. So Congress gets to declare war. That's one of their other powers. But the president can send troops into countries so long as it's not a war. It could be a military, military exercise or human rights mission. He can send them in there. They can only stay for so long. Congress doesn't like it when presidents do that, right? Because it's kind of infringing on their territory a little bit, but presidents frequently will do that. Power to pardon criminals, power to negotiate treaties. So we already went over veto. These other ones are relatively easy. President just gets to do these things. This one is a little bit harder, okay? The last power that's important is that of executive order, or what we call administrative decree. This is part of the president's power as chief executive, okay, right? He gets not only to set, he gets to enforce the laws, but also he's the number one guy in the federal bureaucracy, everything beneath him, so he gets to set rules and regulations that apply to the federal bureaucracy only. This is only part here is incredibly important. It only applies to the federal bureaucracy. Let me give you an example. Before a recent set of executive orders by Barack Obama, the military policy regulating being gay in the military was called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. What that meant was that you could be gay so long as you didn't talk about it. Don't ask, you're not supposed to ask somebody, and if you're asked, you don't tell. Don't ask, don't tell, mum's the word. What do you kids say? Oh, on the down low, as you kids these days say, right? Keep it on the DL. I hear that's an Urban Dictionary thing that people say nowadays. But that was basically the policy. Don't ask, don't tell, that's the rule and regulation. Who had done that? Bill Clinton. Don't ask, don't tell was done by Bill Clinton. It's an executive order. It applies only to the military, okay? Only to the military. He didn't have to ask Congress to pass a law. He just said, hey, this is my bureaucracy. They do what I tell them to do. And in this case, what I want them to do is don't ask, don't tell. Now, presidents, of course, Bill Clinton did, for example, in this case, talk to people before signing executive orders. Calls in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, hey, can we have people who are out in the military? And they go, well, nervous about this, right? Don't forget, Bill Clinton was back in the 90s. That was actually, internet was just coming of age. Amazon was just taking off, right? So that was a long time ago, and they were a little nervous about it. They said, we have some concerns about this. So don't ask, don't tell was actually a bit of a compromise position that Clinton took. He didn't have to take that compromise position. He could have just said to the military, yeah, I understand you have concerns. Too bad. I'm the president. This is how it's going to be. But he didn't. He listened, and most presidents do. They take advice before they act, okay? While don't ask, don't tell was policy, not law, for 20 years, Obama wanted to open up the military more to same-sex couples, and so he signed actually a series of executive orders saying that it was okay to be out in the military and also to give spousal benefits to same-sex partners, etc., right? So one of the real failings of don't ask, don't tell isn't just that you can't talk about it, maybe that's annoying, maybe not, but if you were married, even under a recognized marriage by California and you had a same-sex partner, the military didn't recognize it. So Obama said, okay, you can be out in the military, but really what matters here is, if you get sick, you can visit your partner in the hospital, right? That's like a big deal. You're only allowed to, it's family, it's all that's allowed to visit, and if the military doesn't recognize your marriage, you're in a military hospital, you're not going to get in to be able to see your wife or husband. Things like health benefits. If you're getting a health benefit and you're married, usually your partner also gets some kind of health benefit. Don't ask, don't tell, none of that was happening. So Obama, through a series of executive orders, has been overturning don't ask, don't tell, and basically saying, look, we're just treating same-sex couples like other couples now. So let's sum it up a little bit, right? This is the 3 branches of government. This is a quick and easy one. But let's think about how they all work together. One of the things that our founding fathers, the guys who wrote the Constitution, George Washington, Jefferson, Adams, all these guys, one of the things they wanted in our government was to divide power amongst the different branches so that no one single branch could just do whatever it wants, right? Legislature passes laws, president gets to veto or sign laws. Then the Supreme Court's going to come check and make sure that those laws don't violate the Constitution. Everybody gets a sort of piece of the pie, right? This type of system is frequently referred to as checks and balances because each branch is supposed to watch the others and keep them in line. Sometimes it actually does lead to inaction. No doubt about it. If one branch of government just doesn't want anything to happen, be it just like they're out of step with the other 2 branches, they can really hold up the process quite a bit. So if one branch refuses to play nice, they can slow down the process for everybody. But overall, this system does a really admirable job at making sure laws that get passed take into account a wide array of interests and needs of the American people. The fact that everybody has a hand in the process sometimes almost always slows it down. Sometimes it brings it almost to a complete halt. But it also helps to ensure that decisions are more likely to be in line with the majority, and not just the majority, but really the majority and the minority, right? The Senate has the minority filibuster, which really makes sure that laws don't get passed that are prejudicial to the minority party. The president's there with his own ideas, then of course the Supreme Court checks everything and makes sure nothing super wacky happens. Okay, so that's my lecture on the checks and balances, and stay tuned for our next lecture.